Nostalgia is a fickle beast. On one hand, seeing an old commercial, movie, or video game you played when you were a kid is a very special feeling. The kind that makes you all tingly and warm inside when you think about it. But on the other hand, nostalgia can also cloud our perception of certain things as well. You know, the classic rose-tinted glasses. It's not necessarily the case that all the media you used to consume back then was better than what we have now, but because you were young and didn't see anything like it before, it captivated you like nothing else. Nostalgia is very powerful, and the people who make the media know that too. Today's market is flooded with nostalgia bait. Sequels to movies that nobody really needed but that sell anyways because of the title alone. Musicians saying that they're going back to their roots every single album cycle, only to disappoint everyone over and over again. And of course, new installments in the long-running video game franchise trying desperately to reconnect to their original fan base. At this point, I think every big media franchise like this has tried to go for the member berries approach at least once, and the resulting reaction from the fans varies wildly. Sometimes they love it and actually celebrate a return to form for their beloved franchise. Other times though, they feel like they got tricked by nostalgia baiting and ended up with a Imagine Dragons song and a battle royale tacked onto the game instead. But where the big corps falter and continue to lose touch with their fans, the indie scene always comes in and starts to thrive. The amount of standout indie titles that have been released throughout the past decade is astounding. So astounding, in fact, that I made 2 whole videos talking about how amazing that part of the gaming industry really is. Indies have been at the forefront of quality and innovation for a long time now. I mean, just look at the progression of the Game Awards nominees over the years and you will find a steady uptick in indie titles the more you look. What these games lack in terms of manpower, budget, graphics, or large marketing campaigns, they make up for with creativity, uniqueness, and a very personal approach. When a big company like Activision is promising that Call of Duty is going back to its roots for the 16th time, you are infinitely less convinced that this new game is actually going to feel like the classics you remember playing 10 years ago. But when a small studio like Yacht Club shows off a game like Mina the Hollower, and it actually looks like something that could have been ripped straight out of a Game Boy Color, it's an entirely different story. Mina the Hollower is one of the highest rated games of the year, with many calling for it to be a Game of the Year nominee already. Now, while I personally think it's a bit too early for that, seeing how we're just halfway through the year, we have like 1 billion games still coming out later, I cannot deny that all this praise made me curious. And after playing the opening chapter, I immediately understood why people were so infatuated with this tiny little mouse game. Mina is not just using its retro aesthetic to farm nostalgia points from jaded old school fans who remember when gaming was good, but instead, it wholeheartedly embraces the era of games that it has been inspired by and uses it to craft something entirely brand new. Now, obviously one of the reasons that games like this are using this visual style is that it's a lot cheaper to do so. Most indie studios operate on a very small scale, only having a handful of employees and having to make every dollar count during development. And that can be really hard to manage. So in order to make sure that the studio survives and the project doesn't become a massive burden for them, going for a more retro game approach is usually a safe bet. But in the case of Mina the Hollower, having the game rooted in this early 90s Game Boy Color aesthetic is what creates this feeling of familiarity as well. A notion that this could have been a game that you used to play on your actual Game Boy Color when you were a kid. Now obviously when you think a bit deeper about it all, you would realize that the Game Boy would probably explode if you tried to run Mina the Hollower on it, but that is also besides the point. Just the idea that it could have ran on it is enough to sell the experience and fantasy of playing such a title. And everything from the visuals, the cutscenes, the sound design, the soundtrack, which is very good by the way, it's been playing in the background this whole time, and its very high difficulty absolutely put it in line with other games of this era. Oftentimes, these retro throwback projects don't feel quite right. Sure, they might have had an old school graphic style and 1,000 references to older games, but then the gameplay is off and it just comes across as boring or one note. Rad Rogers is a good example of this, a game that tried so hard to emulate the old Amiga platformers only to misunderstand completely what made them so charming and beloved in the first place. And so the result is a hodgepodge of various design ideas and around 1 billion references to other games, without ever feeling like it is retro, and instead it comes off as bland and very out of touch. Other times, a game can be so faithful to its inspirations that it forgets why certain gameplay styles have fallen out of favor over the years. They're so focused on preserving the feel of the original title that they tend to forgo important features like quality of life, accessibility settings for the impaired, or other improvements to game feel. There's a game I played for my Steam Next Fest Roundup video, which you should definitely watch, a few months ago called Spy Jobs Gaiden that is, in my opinion, absolutely a part of this category of game. This is a game that very much wants to emulate the feeling of the classic Metal Gear games back before they had Solid or Rising in the title. These are some of the earliest entries in the stealth game genre, and while they are absolutely impressive for their time, playing them nowadays can be very frustrating. It has very outdated mechanics like cycling through your inventory one by one to find a specific item, a weird control scheme, and generally unintuitive and obtuse design, which was quite common with games of this era actually. Spy Jobs emulated this exact gameplay to such an extent that I personally experienced many of the same issues as I just described. Enemy detection is weird and oftentimes hard to gauge whether someone actually saw you or not. Shooting is very clunky and didn't feel responsive at all, and in general, I had a lot of trouble getting to grips with the game's mechanics. While it absolutely nails the aesthetic and the vibes, the gameplay ended up being so faithful that it actively hurt my enjoyment of it, which is a shame. Finding the right balance between old school design and new school evolution is very difficult to do, and this brings me to the next category of these games from an alternate timeline, so to speak, and that is the Spiritual Successor. A spiritual successor is a piece of art that itself is heavily inspired by a previously released piece of art, but is not an official sequel and does not share the same intellectual property as that previous piece. Now, these things do exist in any form of media, but they are especially common in the video game space, and I am positive that you can name at least 5 of them off the top of your head right now. But even with this subsection of games, there are also important distinctions to be made when it comes to how a game tries to be that spiritual successor and to what extent they try to adhere to the original. Let's take From Software, for example, because if you really think about it, their whole catalog is just a list of spiritual successors. And to illustrate that, let me describe their game Kingsfield to you, FromSoft's first ever video game. Kingsfield is a dungeon crawler / RPG hybrid set in a dark fantasy world focused on exploration and discovery. Combat is very difficult and could be considered clunky, but feels very rewarding once you understand how it works. The storytelling is very obtuse and intentionally vague to make the world seem more mysterious and further that sense of discovery as you progress through the game. It also has a blue glowing sword that is really hard to get and shoots magic. Sound familiar? Well, it should, because you could literally just copy paste that exact same description earlier and apply it to any other fantasy game that FromSoft has ever made. Nearly all of From Software's RPGs are just games that have been inspired by their previous games. Kingsfield inspired Demon's Souls inspired Dark Souls inspired Elden Ring, and their next game, Duskbloods, is likely going to be inspired by a bunch of stuff from Bloodborne, which in itself is an offshoot of Dark Souls. But as strange as that progression is, it's also pretty damn cool at the same time. Games like the original Dark Souls are so incredibly influential and have shaped people's lives to such an extent that the number of games made in their image is just growing year on year. And it is not just the Souls-like craze either. I can guarantee you that almost every single highly rated indie game that has come out in the last 10 years, in one way or another, is a spiritual successor, or at least heavily inspired by a game series that is as old as most of my audience. Expedition 33? Final Fantasy X. Dispatch? Telltale's The Walking Dead. Hollow Knight? Castlevania. Ultra Kill? Devil May Cry and also Doom. Signalis? Silent Hill. Stardew Valley, Harvest Moon, Unturned, DayZ, City Skylines, SimCity, Crow Country, Resident Evil, Ion Fury, Duke Nukem, Path of Exile, Diablo, and so on and so on and so on. I could go like this for 30 minutes if I wanted to. There are so many games that are trying to pay homage to a title that was their previous inspiration, and that's completely understandable. Art inspires other art, and so when you see some solo developer trying their hand at making yet another Souls-like, you can't really blame them. Yeah, the genre may be oversaturated now, but you also cannot deny the vice grip that Dark Souls had on so many of the people who played it. Even nowadays, you get new age gamers making videos about playing Dark Souls or Elden Ring for the first time and how it genuinely ruined other video games for them. It also inspired those people to branch out of the video game space and get into manga, most notably Berserk, which in itself is art that inspired Dark Souls. These games are so utterly ingrained engrossing that people have become obsessed with them and want to get more and more out of it, even well past their 10th playthrough. And nowhere near is this more apparent than with the growing number of mods and fan projects, more specifically, fan remakes and demakes. These are a fascinating little ecosystem that just shows how far certain fans of a game will go in order to make their favorite game feel fresh and new again. Now, a remake is something that we've all become very accustomed with now that big development studios have been churning those out left, right, and center, but a demake? Now that is something worth talking about. Essentially, the idea behind demaking a game is to imagine what that game would have been like if it released way earlier than it actually did, recreating the experience as closely as possible while at the same time needing to adhere to the limitations of the era. The most popular modern example of this has to be Bloodborne PSX. A full, top-to-bottom recreation of Bloodborne within the style of the original PlayStation, and let me tell you, this game is fucking awesome. The amount of detail and passion that the developer Lilith Walker has put into this project is insane. The low poly models, the shot-for-shot recreation of the cutscenes, the sound effects that have been retroactively bit crushed and distorted, the remade music with different instruments to fit the original sound chip quality, the choppy yet still recognizable animations, and even the fucking boss fights have been fully recreated with the appropriate music, sound effects, attack timings, and even their intros like the Cleric Beast, for example. The amount of love and development time that Lilith put into this project is staggering, which makes me so sad that I have to tell you the project got copyright struck by Sony last year and had to be taken down. We really aren't allowed to have any good things when it comes to Bloodborne. Of course, Bloodborne PSX was not the only demake project. There have been many of others over the years as well, like the 2019 bootleg collection from Devolver, an assortment of funny demakes of some of Devolver's biggest indie hits like Downwell, Enter the Gungeon, and Hotline Miami. 2010 saw the release of Pixel Force Left 4 Dead, a recreation of the iconic horde shooter in the form of a top-down NES game. The coolest part about this game is that it not only features all of Left 4 Dead 1's content, it even has a functional two-player co-op mode that you can play right now for free. However, while there are a few other projects, you really don't have a lot of options for demakes as opposed to remakes. And that's mainly because these types of games are very difficult to make. The amount of reverse engineering that has to be done in order to replicate not just the visuals, but also the feeling of playing a game on the PS1, GameCube, the NES, or whatever is immense. No matter if it's a demake of an existing game or a brand new project aiming to replicate the style of this old technology. But out of all of the projects that I've talked about thus far, this last one that I want to talk about is something that I think is really special, just because of how far the developer took this idea, and that is KUROHI from solo developer Sergio Elizondo. KUROHI is a fascinating little game that shows just how far some people are willing to take the concept of a new retro game. This is a brand new Metroidvania releasing in just a few short months exclusively for the Game Boy Color. If you want to buy the game, you have to pre-order it on the website and then have the game's physical Game Boy Color cartridge shipped to your doorstep. At the time of me finding out about this blew my mind. I had no idea that 1, people still make games for these ancient systems, and 2, that there's a whole ass community of people doing this. These games are called homebrews and refer to unofficial titles made by passionate developers for retro systems. Oftentimes, these games try to slot themselves into an already established genre. In the case of KUROHI, this was a hybrid between Zelda, Metroid, and Gradius. Obviously, the game is very simple. You're working with 30-year-old hardware here. But when I got the game's demo that the developer graciously provided to me, I couldn't help but be fascinated by it. The Game Boy Color is by no means a powerful console, and so making a fully fledged, multi-hour-long Metroidvania with a hub world, different biomes, persistent upgrades, dialogue, shop systems, a side-scrolling shooting segment, boss fights, and so much more is just extremely impressive on a technical level. I'm really glad I discovered KUROHI, not just because the game itself is shaping up to be really fun, but also because it introduced me to this brand new world of gaming that I had never ever heard of before. Homebrews like KUROHI are extreme labors of love, honoring a bygone era of games in a way that retains the authenticity and vibe of these old titles. I'm sure that you've caught yourself thinking back to the time when you were young and discovered video games for the first time, remembering all the classics you played, the consoles you used to play them on, and how stepping into this brand new world made you feel. How you would love to return to those days, even if just for a little bit, and being able to experience all of this for the first time again. And people are trying that. Homebrews like KUROHI and emulation websites like retroachievements.com really prove that there is a dedicated community of people out there who still cherish and play these old titles regularly. Like I said in the intro, nostalgia is indeed a fickle beast. We know that we can't go back. We cannot wipe our memory and experience our favorite games for the first time again. But what we can do is try to find new and innovative ways to play these games that manage to give us that same feeling of childlike wonder. And the projects that I've showed you today might be the closest we will ever get to replicating that. Once again, a massive thank you goes out to Sergio for allowing me to play his game early. It's super cool, and I hope that you're gonna make some weird stuff in the future. I really, really hope so. A link to both his Kickstarter campaign and the official KUROHI website are down in the description below if you want to check it out yourself. Supporting passion projects like these is the reason why I make videos. I want to see new artists succeed with their weird and quirky ideas, and so I'll always give them a platform here on this channel. So if you want to see me talk about weird art some more, subscribe to the channel, like these videos, or go the extra mile and go support me on patreon.com/Ridley. It really does mean the world to me. Every single interaction on these videos is not at all taken for granted here, and I'm just so happy I get to do this. I know this video is quite different from the usual stuff I make. Life's been very stressful recently. I'm going back to school in a few months, and I'm trying to set up some IRL stuff. So it's been very over and under the past couple of weeks. But hey, the horrors may persist, but so do I. I got some other stuff cooking in the future. I'm really excited to share that with you. But for now, thank you so much for watching my videos and listening to my rambles. I love you all. Ciao, ciao. Which video game world, space, and atmosphere caught your attention so much you couldn't stop thinking about it long after playing? And would you ever cover it in a video? Unironically, there's too many to count, so I'm just probably going to go with Monster Hunter. I've been a Monster Hunter fan for so long, and every time a new game comes out, the worlds that they manage to create with their technology and all of like the fauna and flora that like interact with each other and all these different things coming together, especially with the newer games like World and especially Wilds, that's I think the ones that have captivated me the most. I don't know if I ever want to make dedicated videos on those games. I'll probably put them into like a more overarching topic like the best game worlds or whatever the fuck, you know, that kind of stuff, right? So yeah, probably something like that.